This video is brought to you by Chime, the most loved banking app. I started using them about a year ago to help build my credit long before I knew they would be sponsoring a video like this, and I have to say, I have been impressed. It is digital first, meaning less overhead compared to traditional banks, so they can pass those savings on to their members and offer perks like 5% cash back with the Chime Card and 3.75% APY in savings. Right now, if you sign up through my link, chime.com/companyman, they are offering a $75 bonus. It only takes a few minutes and the link is in the description. Ford versus Chevy is one of the biggest, most competitive, longest-lasting rivalries in the business world, dating back over a century to the early days of the auto industry. These have been the top two US auto brands for as long as any of us have been alive, and throughout that time, there have been numerous discussions and debates among car enthusiasts comparing them. Probably the biggest single difference here is that Ford-branded vehicles are made by a company called Ford, whereas Chevy or Chevrolet branded vehicles are made by a company called General Motors, meaning Ford versus Chevy is not a company comparison, but rather a brand comparison, forcing me to approach this a little differently than I normally would. I would say that a big part of this rivalry involves one of these companies releasing a revolutionary new vehicle and then the other company developing a comparable vehicle to compete with it. A recent study showed that Chevy and Ford customers are among the most loyal in the industry, meaning current Chevy or Ford owners are very likely to stick with that brand for their next vehicle purchase. I mean, plenty of people have stuck to one side for their entire lives, so often if there is something new and attractive on the market released by the other side, those loyal customers will sit back and wait until their side comes out with something similar. So for this video, I think it would be interesting to highlight 5 notable times where this has happened, starting off at the very beginning with Ford's Model T versus Chevy's Series 490. See, starting production in 1908, the Model T is the car that made cars popular. Before this, cars were almost exclusively made for wealthier people, and the simplicity of the Model T combined with pioneering assembly techniques made it possible to mass produce it and sell it at an affordable price point. I always thought it was funny that Henry Ford famously said any customer can have a car painted any color that he wants so long as it's black. In 1912, Louis Chevrolet, primarily an auto engineer and race car driver, teamed up with William Durant, primarily a businessman, to release the first Chevrolet car, the Classic 6, which was in fact one of those fancier cars that appealed to a wealthier customer base, so not surprisingly, it never caught on with the general public and was severely overshadowed by the Model T. Louis Chevrolet wanted to continue along that same path, given that he was passionate about creating cool cars, whereas William Durant wanted to build up the business, which meant shifting over to Henry Ford's approach in creating something simpler with a wider appeal. The disagreement caused Chevrolet to leave the company that was named after him, and he went off to start a new company that built race cars, while Durant stuck with it, and in 1915 released a mass-market car called the Series 490. Believe it or not, the 490 in the name referred to the $490 price tag, which was slightly cheaper than the base price for Ford's Model T at the time. Some genius marketing right there, and for the first time, the Model T had some real competition, since customers were now given the choice between Ford or Chevy. Over the next few years, the Series 490 sold so well that Durant was able to acquire General Motors, where Chevy became their brand for lower-end, more widely appealing vehicles. By the 1920s, the industry was evolving. Chevy moved on to their updated Superior series, while Ford continued selling that same Model T for arguably too long. In the end, they sold an unprecedented 15 million units over the course of almost 20 years before shutting down production and closing all of their plants in May of 1927 to prepare them for the production of the Model A that would be introduced in December of that year. Considering Ford was practically shut down for half the year, 1927 marks the first time Chevy surpassed them in sales as America's best-selling car brand. Now, not surprisingly, Ford pulled back ahead shortly after, selling about 5 million Model A's over over the next few years, but Chevy would ultimately pull back ahead in the early 1930s. So in this case, I think you'll agree that Ford was the more innovative one, but Chevy did a great job in following their lead and challenging them with an attractive alternative. Next up on the list is going to be Ford F-Series versus Chevy Silverado. Early on, going way back, it was common for farmers to modify their Model Ts and any other vehicles into pickup trucks. But Ford is credited with selling the first factory-assembled pickup truck in 1925 and is also credited with popularizing that term in the process. In 1948, they introduced their iconic F-Series as their first new launch following World War II, and the F-150, debuting 27 years later, quickly became their most popular offering. Today, they claim that the F-Series has been America's best-selling truck for almost 50 years straight, selling over 800,000 units in 2025, significantly more than the number 2 spot, the Chevy Silverado. In 1960, Chevy started their long-running CK truck series, C referring to the two-wheel drives and K referring to the four-wheel drives. That was Chevy's answer to the F-Series that had gained a lot of popularity throughout the 1950s. In 1975, I believe coincidentally the same year as the F-150, Chevy started selling the Silverado as the top trim level of the CK series, and toward the end of the 1990s, it became its own model that soon replaced the existing series, likely as a response to Ford redesigning their F-Series to be more attractive for everyday use. The F-Series has always outsold the Silverado. However, it is worth mentioning that GM also makes the GMC Sierra, currently ranking as the 6th best-selling vehicle in the US. So if you do a little math and combine the sales of the two, GM as a company technically sells more pickup trucks than Ford. But overall, I would say this is another example of Ford leading and Chevy following. Going back to the list, another example of fierce competition between the two would be Ford Thunderbird versus Chevy Corvette. And remember, both of these brands were established by offering simple, low-priced vehicles accessible to the average customer. When it comes to higher-end vehicles, GM acquired Cadillac in 1909 and Ford acquired Lincoln in 1922, in addition to creating Mercury in 1938, keeping their luxury vehicles separated into their own brands. But as the world progressed, highways were being built across the country and the demand for vehicles was just exploding in the 1950s, there was room for new markets to be established with different levels of quality and price. So in 1953, Chevy released the Corvette, a two-seat sports car that was heavily inspired by designs much more popular in Europe. The following year, not necessarily as a response to the Corvette, but recognizing similar opportunities, Ford released the Thunderbird as a personal luxury car, justifying the higher price not only by performance with a V8 engine, but by comfort, offering things like leather seats, power windows, and more space. Originally, it only had 2 seats, but then they started offering a 4-seat option a few years later, and it proved to be much more practical and successful than the Corvette, though I should point out, it was about $500 cheaper. The Chevy Impala was kind of an alternative to the Thunderbird throughout the 1960s, but then in 1970, the Chevy Monte Carlo was released as a more direct response to the Thunderbird in the personal luxury vehicle market and outsold it by almost 3 times within that first year. However, the Corvette has obviously better withstood the test of time, considering the Thunderbird, Monte Carlo, and Impala are no longer in production. So this case is a little more complicated. Even though Chevy was first with the Corvette, Ford followed it with something kind of different that was more widely appealing. And then, much like the previous examples, Chevy responded to it with something more directly comparable. The next comparison I want to look at is Ford Mustang versus Chevy Camaro, a fun one. In 1964, the Mustang was among the all-time most successful launches for Ford. It was a unique combination of price, performance, style, and practicality that proved to be attractive to the younger demographic and was heavily promoted to them. It was such a success, it essentially established a new category that has been labeled the pony car. After the Mustang quickly sold over 1 million units over the next few years, Chevy introduced the Camaro as a direct response. Intended for the same customers and sold at a similar price, it was not nearly as successful in the beginning. In that first year, the Camaro sold less than half as many units as the Mustang, and it took more than a decade for the Camaro to outsell it for the first time in 1977. But overall, I think anyone would consider the Mustang to be the bigger success. Unlike the Camaro, it has remained in continuous production, and in my opinion at least, has one of the coolest logos out there. So yet again, Ford came out with something uniquely attractive, and Chevy did a decent job at creating a similar similar alternative. My last comparison is going to be Ford Bronco versus Chevy Blazer, and I have to acknowledge that both sides here have been pioneering in the SUV market. Many recognize Chevy as originating the SUV, with the Suburban starting all the way back in the 1930s, while the Ford Bronco in the 1960s is often recognized as the first vehicle to be marketed as an SUV, designed mostly for off-roading at the time. It was released about a year and a half after the Mustang, so Ford kind of tied them together by naming them both after horses, and I have to say, another great logo. But then, only a few years later, Chevy responded with a bigger, more powerful SUV called the K5 Blazer that surpassed the Bronco in sales within its first few years. Then, in the 1980s, Chevy released the S10 Blazer, which was a smaller version that was nicknamed the Baby Blazer. Ford responded to that with the Bronco 2, nicknamed the Baby Bronco, but the Blazer continued to be more popular. In the 1990s, SUVs were becoming more popular among large families, just transporting them for everyday purposes, so Chevy redesigned the S10 Blazer to include more doors and other features to accommodate the families, while Ford started selling the Explorer. By 1996, they discontinued the Bronco altogether, only to bring it back 25 years later, while the Blazer was also brought back after many years of being off the market. As I'm sure you can tell, it almost becomes trivial trying to follow the path of all these vehicles over the course of decades, but when it comes to SUVs, I would say it has been much more of a back and forth than the other categories. Looking back at the list, comparing Ford and Chevy just in this particular way, my conclusion is that Ford has stood out as the more revolutionary brand. In 4 of these 5 categories, Ford was first, and at least in my opinion, ultimately more iconic. But I want to be extremely clear that these comparisons are only the ones that I concluded to be some of the biggest and most significant. There are so many other potential comparisons and ways to approach this that might likely end in different results. All of this has simply been my best attempt to reduce more than a century of complicated competition into a short and simple YouTube video. Please tell me if you know of any other comparisons that might be meaningful or anything else you would like to add to these comparisons. And also, let me know in the comments, what are your thoughts about Ford versus Chevy? Historically, looking at the big picture, which one would you say has been the more innovative or impactful brand? I guess what I'm asking is, who would you declare the leader of this rivalry? That is a big question, and as a customer, which one do you think has been better? There is a decent chance that you have owned one of these vehicles at some point, so what has been your experience and how is it compared to other experiences? And any other thoughts you have about Ford, Chevy, or anything else in this video, leave them in the comments. I'd like to hear what you have to say. Chime is today's sponsor, a banking app that I've been using for a while now without hesitation. The funds are FDIC insured through Chime's bank partners, so the money is secure. I appreciate the feature where they show me a good visual of how much money I've been spending from month to month and a breakdown of which categories I'm spending that money on. It's all presented in a way that helps me better understand where my money is going, and if you meet the $3,000 monthly qualifying direct deposit threshold, your account automatically updates to Chime Prime, which includes, in my opinion, some of the most attractive features out there, like 5% cash back in a category of your choice with the Chime Card and 3.75% APY on savings. To put that into perspective, that is 9 times the national average savings rate of 0.38%. So for example, $6,000 in the account would earn $225 in a year as opposed to $23 with the national average. You set it up once, your money grows automatically, and it isn't locked up. You can access it easily at any time. I'm just saying, every day your money earns 0.38% APY instead of 3.75, you are leaving money on the table, so you might want to jump on this by visiting chime.com/companyman to sign up, and you get a $75 bonus when you do. The link is in the description. Thank you for watching.